State Department official speaks out about how the CIA has exacted revenge on him. He says, because he dared to tell the truth about a CIA cover-up of the involvement of its paid informants in torture and murder in Guatemala. Dr. Richard Nuccio is that senior State Department official, the former special advisor to President Clinton on Cuba, and before that, the U.S. government's special envoy in Guatemala. Dr. Nuccio says he blew the whistle, broke the code of silence because of the involvement of the CIA's paid operatives, its spies in Guatemala, in the brutal murders of an American citizen, the husband of another American, and what he describes as a litany of crimes against humanity.
Including torture and murder.
Torture and murder.
Torture and murder.
According to Rick Nuccio, ever since he revealed what he knew about the CIA's spies in Guatemala, he says he has been the subject of a ruthless effort, at first to prosecute him, and now to force him out of the U.S. government.
I used to work at the White House. I used to be the president's Cuba advisor. I'm back at the State Department spending most of my time trying to answer charges against me.
The CIA's charges are that Dr. Nuccio violated national security when, without authorization, he briefed a congressman on the Intelligence Oversight Committee about the misconduct of the CIA's spies in Guatemala, and that he also confirmed to the press the identity of a secret paid CIA informant. Under U.S. law, it is illegal to reveal the identity of a clandestine agent or informant of the CIA.
I didn't reveal classified information publicly to anyone, and yet I'm being hounded out of government service by the CIA for telling Congress what it had a right to know.
Why do they have this vendetta against Rick Nuccio?
I broke the code. You don't reveal misbehavior by the CIA and survive inside the system.
The misbehavior, the CIA crimes that Rick Nuccio is talking about came to his attention because of Jennifer Harper, an American citizen who was searching for her missing husband, a Guatemalan guerrilla leader.
He's somewhere here in Guatemala, and I don't plan to leave without him.
2 years ago, we reported on Ms. Harper's hunger strike in Guatemala, where she was trying to force the government of Guatemala to produce her husband or his remains. In that broadcast, we reported that the U.S. government and the CIA knew a lot more than what they were saying publicly about the fate of Jennifer Harper's husband.
All I've ever seen the embassy do is cover up over and over and over again.
The U.S. State Department official who was in charge of Jennifer Harper's case at the time was none other than Rick Nuccio. And Nuccio says he repeated to Jennifer what his colleagues at the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala and the CIA had told him.
We don't know anything about this case except what we're told by the Guatemalan government. And Guatemalan government was saying he committed suicide. He was killed and he's buried. He's buried here, he's buried there. Dig up that body, dig up this body.
Rick Nuccio says that because of Jennifer's hunger strike and the publicity surrounding it, he ordered a complete review of the U.S. government's files, and to his surprise he found that review turned up this document. A CIA report that Jennifer's husband was captured and kept alive by the Guatemalan army. And then, in this CIA report, it was revealed that a CIA spy was assigned to oversee the interrogation and debriefing of the captured guerrilla.
Inside the State Department, I pressed, what are we going to do with this report? This makes me out to be a liar. It makes the U.S. administration out to be a liar before Congress.
Because you've been saying that
we don't know anything about this case.
Then Rick Nuccio says his outrage grew as he learned that the CIA had more reports from its informants about the fate of Jennifer's husband.
Saying contradictory things. Saying he's alive, he's dead. He was killed immediately, he was killed after a long time. But the most important thing, that we knew something at all, which is not what we had said before.
But despite his new knowledge, Rick Nuccio says that he could not tell Jennifer Harper because the information came from what were then still top secret classified CIA reports.
I was not authorized to tell her classified information. If something is classified, I can't tell it to you, even if it's about your mother or the dearest person in your life. I go to jail if I tell you what's in the classified report.
Why did the CIA withhold this information from the State Department and from the committees of the Congress?
Why would the CIA risk covering up what they knew about the fate of Jennifer Harper's husband? Well, it turns out that in those CIA reports that Rick Nuccio read, there was startling new information. About this man, a Guatemalan Army Colonel, Julio Roberto Alperez, who was being paid by the CIA to provide them with information about Guatemala's 30-year-long civil war with the guerrillas there. And according to those reports, the colonel was not only involved in the interrogation of Jennifer Harper's husband, but in the cover-up of the savage, senseless murder of this man, an American citizen, Michael Devine, who with his wife operated a small hotel in rural Guatemala.
A military patrol, a Guatemalan Army patrol. For whatever reason, they took him away, and he was found later brutally murdered. And then the Guatemalan Army tried to cover up that murder. And it looks like Alperez,
Same fellow, working for the CIA.
at that time on the CIA's payroll, indeed, had helped to cover up that the Army had murdered Devine. That was enough to convince me that this perhaps was why the agency had kept this information so buried within the U.S. government.
Dr. Nuccio says he tried to get his colleagues in the State Department and the National Security Council to act on what he had learned, but he was told to do nothing that would antagonize the CIA.
Informally, I was told, please don't do this kind of thing.
Because?
They're going to cut us off at the CIA. They're not going to, if they find out you're over here criticizing the CIA, they're going to stop giving us information. Don't do this. Don't criticize the CIA.
So you were, it was not just in your head, it was in your heart that you had lied to Jennifer, that you had information, and you had not been forthcoming.
I turned gray between October and early February. I slept very rarely, full night. I had lied to people that had known me and trusted me for years. I had to live day after day, night after night, without being able to go back to those people and say, what I told you was wrong. It was tormenting me. But the laws that I lived under, the oaths that I had signed, prevented me from telling anyone about this.
Distraught and guilt-ridden, after 6 months of silence, Rick Nuccio decided to go to someone he felt the law allowed him to talk to. Someone with a security clearance. A member of the House Intelligence Oversight Committee, Congressman Robert Torricelli. What was Congressman Torricelli's reaction when you told him this?
He was really furious. He said to me what he said publicly, that this was a rogue CIA, that this was a violation of U.S. law, that I was concealing a crime against an American citizen.
Outraged by what he called a CIA cover-up, Congressman Torricelli sent this letter to the White House and to the New York Times, identifying the CIA spy, Colonel Alperez. Then Torricelli went public, accusing the CIA of covering up both murders.
I do not believe that any member of Congress or anyone in this government has a responsibility to protect the identity of a foreign intelligence source, even in contract with the United States government, if they murder an American citizen. I believe this is an obstruction of justice and a crime to do so.
Torricelli's actions set off an internal investigation by the CIA, after which the CIA director fired 2 senior CIA officials and disciplined 8 more. But the story doesn't end there. The Justice Department investigation found no basis for prosecuting any of those CIA agents, but the prosecutor did go after Rick Nuccio. Why? For allegedly violating the Agent Identification Act by revealing the name of the top-secret CIA agent, Colonel Alperez, to Congressman Torricelli, and for allegedly confirming that information anonymously to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Remember, under U.S. law, it's a crime, a violation of national security, publicly to identify a CIA spy.
Mike's expertise is reading human bones for signs of crime. And when these crimes are on a massive scale, her training in archaeology and anthropology prove an invaluable combination.
One of the areas in which forensic anthropologists are very, very much involved is human rights work, and particularly where you have mass graves, because this is where our expertise are completely apropos. The archaeological technique to appropriately recover the remains, and then the anthropological techniques to analyze them.
Village in Guatemala. 18 years ago, a massacre occurred here at the height of the Civil War. Early one morning, anti-government rebels passed down this hill, pursued hours later by an army unit. Most of the villagers fled to safety. Others were not so lucky. By that afternoon, 23 had been butchered, men, women, and children. When the villagers returned, they found the bodies of their friends and relatives in a burned-out house. They carried their dead through a cornfield and hastily buried them in a well covered with blankets. Since then, they have lived alongside the unmarked grave, too fearful of the army to give the victims a proper burial. Under the watchful eyes of the authorities, Reichs will draw on her skills as an archaeologist, working with Guatemalan colleagues to recover the bones. Then, as a forensic scientist, she will work to piece them together in the hopes of identifying the victims and reconstructing the last moments of their lives. Reichs has been asked to help by Dr. Clyde Snow. For the last 20 years, working with local people, Snow has helped identify victims of genocide worldwide through the use of forensic anthropology.
There's only one Clyde Snow. Clyde always had a commitment to training the local people so that they could take over the investigation of their own situation. And the team working today in Guatemala is a result of that.
Snow hopes his work will help heal festering wounds and bring closure.
The value of this kind of work is several-fold. First and foremost, we hope we are collecting evidence here that might be used in a court of law someday. So that's one reason. Serve justice. Second, his relatives, his families, have known for 20 years in Guatemala in a very cruel state of suspension. And we've learned that for them, this is a terrible moment when these bones come up from the earth, but
Can you see?
oh yes, I can see perfectly. Get through the process of grieving. The third reason is to put it on the historical record. Even if justice never gets around to being done, at least the revisionists can't come down 20 years later, 50 years later and say, this never happened. Because it's hard to argue with a skull that's got a gunshot wound in the back of the head.
As the work gets underway, the team uncovers the first tiny bit of evidence that they are digging in the right place.
What do we have here?
Well, we found these bones in this area.
Okay. So I see you got a lower humerus here, a piece of arm bone. Very little burning in some parts. Over here,
yeah.
And then you've got more blackening here, and then the intense burning on the cranial fragment there. Did you expect them to be fragmented?
And I hope that everything will be better than this, because this is nothing. If everything is like this,
It's difficult.
it's difficult to work.
Difficult. Not impossible. Difficult.
Yeah, it's difficult.
As the dig continues, blood samples are taken from local villagers. They will be used to do DNA tests on the bones in an effort to identify the victims. Donna Maria Peño takes the test. By a quirk of fate, she was away the day of the massacre. But she believes that 12 of the 23 skeletons expected to be found in the pit are those of her children and grandchildren.
When I returned, I found that I had 4 daughters killed and my 8 grandchildren. Of my grandchildren in the grave, the youngest are 4 years old, 3 years, 3 months, and a 3-day-old baby. I called for the neighbors to come and help me bury them. Later, the army returned and kidnapped my son, and I still don't know what happened to him. I'm feeling very hurt, even after all these years, and I hope that the people who committed this horrible atrocity will have to face justice. And it's time to lay the remains to rest in a cemetery.
The DNA testing may allow Donna Maria Peño to bury her dead again.
Welcome to Analysis of News special open session on the U.S. and Latin America news coverage and cover-ups. We see here at the start that we have a murder mystery, a mass murder mystery, and as presented at least in this documentary, Americans are lending a helping hand. Forensic anthropologists are helping their families figure out how these people got into their grave. They don't actually get around to explaining how the people got into the grave in this documentary. We'll try to solve that mystery by the end of today, and also try to solve the mystery as to why Clyde Snow and Kathy Reichs, who are in this documentary, were receiving death threats of their team for trying to do this documentation. Passed around 2 attendance sheets, one for my enrolled students and one for guests, including guests from students from my other classes. So please, if you're enrolled in the class, please make sure you sign that you're here. And if you're not enrolled in the class, if you could enter your information there. And if you're not on my mailing list, to enter your email, because I will send you a list, an annotated list of the videos that we watch in each of these open sessions. So also to be, well, first let me have the people who are not in my regular class, and you can just introduce yourselves and why you've come here.
Yeah, sure. I'm Marty Lee. I'm an active professor in the physics department. I know Joshua was over the paper and fascinated by the subject. And you heard we had an opportunity to come back to class. I thought that would be a great opportunity.
I'm Nancy Lambert. I'm also a neighbor, and I was just curious.
Did your friends from the Peace Corps?
No, I don't see them.
And Andrea.
Hey.
Yeah.
I'm Andrea. I'm in another one of his classes, and we get extra credit if we come here.
I'm Patrick. A friend of mine told me about this, and I went to Guatemala in 2015. I'm going back this winter, so it was interesting.
A little bit about it.
Yeah.
A little bit. Anybody else who's not involved in the class? All right, well, let's listen.
I'm ready for the cranium, but we have at least the thorax.
I guess that's one of the hardest things about this job is when you have to deal with little children, let's do the best we can.
When you're working in the grave or in the laboratory, you're a scientist. You're going to be cold, objective. If you need to cry, you can cry at night. And that's the way we learn to handle it.
Working in Guatemala, that was one of the most disturbing situations in which I've ever worked. And I've worked with serial killers, I've worked with murdered children. There was something about that particular situation as we worked in that pit and we were uncovering those infants and those young mothers and those children and looking up around us and seeing the exact same faces looking down at us that had been killed there just 20 years earlier. I found that very disturbing. I also found that very rewarding, and that's really the point of the human rights work.
The first complete skeleton is now ready to be exhumed, so that it can be taken to a lab, identified, and possibly used as evidence in a court case against the murderers.
Se ven los ojos negros.
Here you're hoping that there's going to be some sort of court process, that someone's actually going to be brought to answer for what went on here. So because of that, because it does have that forensic aspect to it, you've got to be much more careful about documenting all the steps in the recovery process.
With the archaeological work underway, the first bones are taken into the lab, so the forensic work can begin. The team reenacts the moment of death by machete.
Oh, we clearly got a metal fragment right here. There's no question about that one.
This one's the one that we recovered.
Okay, and you can actually see that
Yeah, we can see that one. This one looks like it's coming straight across the back.
Okay, straight through
From
the
the
arch.
neck.
So you've got one going
Yeah,
across.
would be
Yeah, this way, and then right across
Probably this
through
way.
the spinal column. Yeah.
Yeah. We have something to ask them. Do you remember if this person went like this?
They go like this, naturally.
Sure.
And that might help us.
Because every little bit of detail that you see that corroborates an eyewitness account can be important in court.
Reichs reconstructs murderous acts from the marks they leave on the bones. She then distills them down to the dry physics of bone tolerances in an effort to get at the truth.
What's interesting is you've got fractures going up to, you get here and then the pressure is released because it can use the suture itself.
Reichs identifies the possible fatal blow that fractured the victim's skull.
There was a very rapid loading of force onto the skull so that it moved right through plastic elastic to failure.
Under Reich's supervision, the intermingled bones of the mass grave are slowly reclaiming their individuality. DNA testing will be used to complete the process of identification.
The Mary Claire King Laboratory in Seattle, Washington offered to perform DNA tests on the cases we do to try to identify scientifically the people we're exhuming. Basically what we do is we take between 3 and 4 teeth, and then we will take blood from the supposed family members. And this sometimes is a problem when we have several families identifying the same skeleton at times. So we'll take them and then we'll say these two families believe that this is their son. We have had some positive results. We have not been able to retrieve DNA in all the cases, unfortunately. So.
Work continues, but so far only 6 people have been charged with complicity in the massacres of the 1980s. The murderers may never be brought to justice.
A little bit of an introduction to our murder mystery, and the questions we'll try to answer today are who is responsible for those bodies being in that mass grave? Are there any other connections between the United States and what happened there than just these forensic anthropologists trying to help these people identify their children and husbands and wives and others? Is there any other connection between the bananas on the stool here and that mass grave that might not seem obvious at first? And related to this is also why so few Americans care to even explore this question or ask any questions about this, and why just not a lot of interest in the United States in asking such questions. The typical story is that the United States goes around the world trying to help people, and we see this in official State Department briefings, such as Colin Powell reporting at this time, the beginning of the invasion of Iraq, on what the United States role is in the world. So let's see what he says, what we're told about our country. This is his 2003 State Department annual report.
State Department's annual report on global human rights was released today. Secretary of State Colin Powell spoke with reporters about it and answered questions about his trip tomorrow to Ankara and Brussels. Secretary Powell was followed by the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, who further discussed the report. This is about 35 minutes.
I'm going to show you
305.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to present the Department's Country Practices Reports for 2002 on human rights practices throughout the world. These congressionally mandated reports reflect the steadfast commitment of the United States to advance internationally agreed human rights principles worldwide. Our country was founded on the precept that freedom is the birthright of every human being, and America is proud to serve as a force for freedom across the globe. As we lead an international campaign against terrorism, we are also working to extend the blessings of freedom at home and abroad. People of every race, religion, and region, people of every color, creed, and continent want to live in freedom and safety and to create a better future for their children. As I speak, U.S. forces and our coalition partners are fighting to protect our country and the world from the potentially catastrophic combination of an outlaw state, weapons of mass destruction, and terrorism. In the process, we are liberating the Iraqi people from a ruthless tyranny that has showed utter contempt for human life. We are resolved to help the Iraqi people achieve a united and stable country and move toward democracy and prosperity under a representative government that respects the rights of all of its citizens. Saddam Hussein's regime is a classic illustration of the fact that such regimes, which ruthlessly violate the rights of their citizens, tend to pose the greatest threats to international peace and stability. In contrast, states which demonstrate a high degree of respect for human rights are likeliest to contribute to international security and well-being. Where human rights and freedoms flourish, terrorists and tyrants do not thrive, and conflict and chaos do not reign. America's democratic values, our national interest, and our obligations to the international community demand that the defense and promotion of human rights are an integral and active part of our foreign policy. Pledge that the United States will always stand for the non-negotiable demands of human dignity.
This sounds sort of consistent with the Americans there to help these people in Guatemala find who violated their human rights. And in other interviews, Colin Powell said things like this: the United States has one terrific record over the last almost 100 years of leaving places better off after we have conducted a military operation. We're certainly seeing that now in the whole Middle East falling apart. But then there's also the question we'll explore in this class in the next session of whether that's actually true. And he's being interviewed by Andrea Koppel, or I assume is Ted Koppel's daughter, who did not think to ask him for any documentation of this assertion, as journalists often are hesitant to do with officials. If you see this same idea stated in our media, that the West, the United States, does not go out and conquer countries by using force. This is something that the evil Russians do, and this is in 2008, still invoking that kind of the Russians or the former Soviet Union being the source of evil in the world, even though the Cold War narrative has lost a lot of its supporting documentation, obviously, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in Eastern Europe, separating from the Soviet Union. But we still have the question of whether the United States, in the embodiment of Barack Obama, has been sufficiently aggressive in fighting the tyranny of the evil other. And you have the United States, Barack Obama saying that we have an enduring, our endless blessings bestow an enduring burden. We welcome our responsibility to lead. We stand for freedom, for justice, for dignity. These are the values that have guided our nation since its founding. And I asked my students the other day how many of you have been told prior to college that you're being taught to think critically. Everybody raised their hand. I asked you how many have been told implicitly or explicitly that the United States is the greatest country in the world. Everybody raised their hand. And I asked you how many of you have been taught to think critically about whether and how the United States is the greatest country in the world, and only one person educated outside of the United States raised his hand. You're constantly told this story. You've heard it from Colin Powell and from President Obama, and it might be true, but that doesn't mean you don't try to document it, prove it, test it, and then you really know it's true, rather than just being told to believe it. Instead, as David Al-Tidy, professor of sociology and journalism at Arizona State University, said that this, not usually what journalists tell us, that TV producers strive to pursue the age-old formula of communicative success in a market situation. Tell the audience what you assume they already know, and tell it through words and images with which they are familiar, and just repeat over and over again things that people already know. So as my students know, this is not, it's not what I do in this class. I try to treat students here as adults and to teach them to think critically, and we look at what the facts demonstrate, regardless of who they end up critiquing, and we don't shy away from controversy. And also, as my students know, I never come in with a very slick text. I don't read to my students prepared lecture. I don't like to use PowerPoint, because I find even some really good PowerPoint presentations are very sort of pre-programmed, and they don't allow to react to people nodding or frowning, or I can't as easily change the order in which I do things or adjust things if I do that. And as some of you may know, NASA has banned the use of PowerPoint because they blame PowerPoint for the Columbia shuttle disaster. And they said if people had just used an overhead projector or given a handout with enough data you can fit on a sheet of paper, instead of just the bullets on a PowerPoint slide, they would have realized that the tiles on the outside were susceptible to failure, which led to the Columbia shuttle disaster. And so I prefer to have a presentation that's a little rougher around the seams, and have students kind of jump in or react. Our regular classes are a little more interactive than I can do today, because we have visitors who won't be coming back next time if we don't finish, or the time after. I hope you will come back next time. So I like to the seams to kind of show, and to have students question what I present as well. And also, since most people today are so used to single screen hegemony, I call it, that you have what you look at your phone, you look at your iPad, you look at your laptop, you look at an LCD TV. I like to always have two screens to get people to think about what they're watching, and to ask some questions, put up comments, transcripts, other things as you're watching. And so most days I have what I call directed dialogue, and that is, I sort of know where I wanted everybody to get to, but we talk through the readings and do other stuff, and kind of go through a pattern of things. There's a little less discussion today in the class because I've got everything kind of tightly timed, but I hope people will stay for the after-class discussion. And basically, unlike this quote from David Al-Tidy, I like to teach students things they don't know. I mean, that may sound silly, but of course education is about teaching people about things they don't know. But I actually think most education is not really about teaching things they don't know. It's mostly teaching people new examples of things they already know. You just got to fill in the details. You take the existing folder system and add a lot of examples, and have students memorize the examples, and then kick those back on a test. Or even when you teach more sophisticated stuff, often you don't really fundamentally challenge the folder system. I don't think that's real education. I think that as much as you can get pushback and hostility when you push people to think in new ways, that's really what education is, to think in new ways. So that's what I try to teach in this class. We look at a number of concepts related to the news, and just to give a very brief review of some of the stuff, so to help my students as we reach the end of the class. There's a very abbreviated form of a number of these frameworks. We looked at just contrasting the ideals of the news media, including being watchdogs on the government, and providing a full spectrum of ideas, and accurate window on the world. And we News media, the only institution in our country protected explicitly in the Constitution, because they're seen as so important in informing the public and in making our democracy work. And as I have an opening quote on our syllabus, James Madison, that if you don't have an educated populace, then you have a tragedy or a farce. That you don't really have a democracy. So that's in essence of what we look at. Then we look at things that journalists claim they do, that we don't make the news, we just report it. We just give you the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how, and you figure it out. We report, you decide. And we suggest that these things may be a little more complicated than they appear. This abbreviated form of what I call my ROSE model, where first we do reasoning about, and the full version of this is on my academia.edu site, in addition to the class site, but if anybody is not in our class. We look first at just issues of reasoning and any conflict between the students at UNH and the police on Main Street, or something that happens in the state during the primary, or something that happens in another country. You can think of what are all the possible ways that journalists could report on this. They could be present to witness it, they could videotape it, they could do research about the participants, the records of the police, the records of the students. They could speak to eyewitnesses, all these sorts of things. And then we look at just what's in the news, the observation, and see of all those possible ways what tends to be in the newspaper, what tends to be on the internet, what tends to be on the radio. And we find a lot of the things that you could do tend not to be there. So just in interactions with police and students at Main Street in Durham, you usually have what a police spokesman says and what a university administrator says, and even if they were not there. And so you have a limited, we analyze that in greater detail as to what tends to get left out of that. But you don't have everything. The point is, you don't have everything when you observe that you could conceivably have. And then we do speculation. Why, of all the possible ways you could report, do you only have this very narrow, relatively narrow, and some of them are just practical time, limited resources. And here we get less agreement than on the first two, because journalists don't like to talk about the pressures that they might feel to say something about people they rely on for news and what will help them get the next story more easily and so forth. But we look at issues of practical connections between journalists and sources, and money issues and other things, and we'll see. And also just the idea that you don't want to criticize the wrong people, as we'll see a little later today. So we then sort of look more critically at these. And then the final one here is evaluation, which I don't expect us to get a lot of agreement on. Some people would say it's really good to censor certain things. You don't want to upset the whole apple cart by, let's say, suggesting that some encounter between a police officer and the student, that the student might be has her rights violated by the police officer. That gets into all that, who do we turn to for order if we start critiquing the police. Same thing with the government or the military. You don't want to ask too many questions in some cases. And other people would say, no, you need to know what really happened to make the system better and make it work better. So I expect that people that articulate all of those evaluative comments, but not necessarily for us to reach any agreement on those, but to recognize that not everything that could be reported tends to be reported, that there tends to be a pattern. So we also then start to question each of these things. So look at why some types of who's tend to dominate as sources and subjects of the news, and other who's do not. That there are familiar themes in the news, while others are less common. And so news, in a sense, is often functionally old, tells the same types of stories over and over again. We look at the functioning of this rush for the news that tends to lead to the coverage of events that have happened in the last 24 hours. Some kind of report is released, there's some kind of violent action, there's some kind of trial that begins, and often things that happen all the time that may be much more significant. Like a bridge collapses, of course, is significant, but it was deteriorating for decades, and the infrastructure has been deteriorating, and the bees are dying, and deregulation of various industries, like the airline industry, is making airline flights more dangerous before you have the crash. And so you have all these enduring things that happen. And if you watch programs like John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, you see he actually does better reporting on those enduring issues about the role of municipal fines and funding cities when people are charged ridiculous interest on tickets until they basically are funding the county or the town on the backs of poor people, or patent trolls. You can see these things on YouTube. John Oliver talk about these companies that just routinely file these patent violations and force people to either spend $1 million defending themselves or give them some payoff. These are things that happen all the time. They're not just things that happen overnight. We saw the same thing with the church abuse scandal. The documents are released today in the Gagin case, so it's a breaking story, but the documents show he was abusing kids since the 1960s, so there was a little bit of slowly getting to that. The rush for the news is the rush for some news. And then we look at the issue of where, which we'll pursue today, where places in the world are often presented symbolically and selectively in the news. And then we spent a lot of time looking at the issue of world views and also narratives in general in the news, where familiar stories tend to get repeated over and over again. And cultural historians, including Robert Darnton, who started out as a cub journalist, says, hey, you know, now that I'm studying these old tales from centuries ago, I see these are the same stories we kept telling in the news, the same themes, and those are the things that make the paper and get attention. In terms of the world, which we'll talk about this class and the next class, we look at Daniel Halen's 3 world views: the Cold War view that had a huge impact on the U.S. and Latin America, the Fortress America view, which is that we have to be strong because we're always fighting some vicious enemy, and to raise any questions is to join the enemy against us. And the human rights perspective, which, as you saw in the quote from Obama and the video from Colin Powell, is often invoked with regards to the enemy violating people's human rights and that the United States protects them. But as we'll see today and on Monday, it's very, very, very rarely invoked in terms of the United States doing anything that violates the human rights of other people. So very selectively told. In terms of the Cold War view, and this was the dominant view of the world from World War II for about 50 years afterward, the world was presented very symbolically like a risk, like the game of Risk, where you have the dark countries and the white countries and those aligned with different sides, and where you can't really tell, let's say with Iran being aligned with the U.S., you can't really tell what's happening to the people in that country, other than that they're on the right side, they're aligned with the West against the evil Soviet Union, and you have the problem then of possibly horrible, horrible things happening to the people in that country, but it's presented in this map as being a good country because it's aligned against the Soviet Union with the United States and others. That view requires at least some kind of history context, because you have to talk about the Soviet Union, which it no longer exists, and you talk about them taking over parts of Europe after the war, you talk about the evils of communism. You have to know a little bit to tell that story. And so for many Americans and for many journalists, it's too complicated. We just need to know we are good, and anybody who critiques us or threatens us in any way, God forbid, attacks us, and I read that both literally and in the story, narratively, then we have to strike back. Everything the United States does is striking back. America fights back. And this was when the U.S. bombed what we were told was a chemical weapons plant in the Sudan. America fights back. And the dominant narrative in this story is, Halen calls it Fortress America in the sense that the United States has to be very strong. That's why we need all these weapons, more weapons than the rest of the world combined. And we need to fight terrorism everywhere it is. And to stamp out anyone who presents any anti-American views, because they could only be based on insanity, because we just go around the world helping people, and for some unknown reason, crazy terrorists attack us. And this has been a long story, starting with the colonists and fighting the dangerous Native Americans, then the anarchists, and the communists, and Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, And basic to this story is the United States never commits any aggression. It only responds to aggression, or preemptively strikes to stop aggression. And that U.S. weapons are always defensive weapons, so we never talk about the biological weapons of the United States as being a threat to anybody. You have, but in an enemy country, even thinking about developing a weapon, that's a threat in this story. You know, how long will it take them to develop these weapons, even if the United States has them? And the United States is altruistic. We, and this is very powerful, we, many of my students, when they write papers, will say, you know, we did this, and I'll write, you know, were you involved? Ah, you were involved. And I say that, I mean, some people say, well, they should write we because we're responsible in democracy for what our government does in our name. But the reason I try to call students' attention to it is that we're good, right? Everybody in this room is good. So if you say we, the tendency initially is to think, well, we must have done it for, we must have done it for a reason, we were misinformed, if it's not a good thing, we were overreacting, whatever. And so I think it's better to say who did it, who actually acted on it. We'll see some examples of that. And certainly the United States never commits any terrorism. They're always in a war against terrorism, and that we are in almost every way the best country in the world. We may not be perfect, but everywhere else is worse. And my argument would be, in terms of presenting this as a proposition, I would ask you to challenge, would be that anything that doesn't fit this, and we'll see some examples in a few minutes, anything that doesn't fit this tends not to get very much attention in our news media, our textbooks, or our education. Because this is the story, you've got to stick with the story. In fact, here, America fights back. It turns out that that plant in the Sudan was not actually a chemical weapons plant. It was a pharmaceutical plant. The U.S. didn't have the evidence, so they ended up not only killing, I mean, just they killed the night watchman, but they also took this desperately poor country and destroyed the pharmaceuticals that were helping keep someone alive and helped to cause individual suffering, measurable suffering among the people of Sudan. And then once that didn't fit the story, when the people on the plant sued the United States and so forth, that then it didn't have any headlines anymore because it didn't fit that tale. So these are the things we'll look at, the frameworks that we'll examine, and we also, the third view is the human rights view, which we here again invoke, especially when other people violate it. But it's a pretty basic idea. When I first gave a little scenario about another planet, my students are very easily to generate that the people on this planet would want to protect their one region of the planet, protect their government from these other empires who would interfere, protect their resources. Many of the students saw Avatar, you know that story. And but when we get to the United States and the world, and things like Latin America, I found in the past, we'll see how you guys do on the next test, that it gets much more difficult for American students to even hypothetically construct a story where the human rights of people are being violated by the United States in any systematic way. So again, it might not be true, but you ought to be able to at least hypothetically construct that story. You should be able to take the same set of facts and construct a Cold War story during the Cold War, a Fortress America story, and a human rights story. And so let me just show again, my students were born after the Cold War ended, so but you still see it invoked. So let's just look a little bit at the story that we were told about the United States compared to other countries.
But communism was an important seed of the 60s because of the fear it generated. Americans feared communism because the Soviet Union had swallowed up country after country after World War II. And it seemed determined to swallow up America as well.
About the age of 13, I and my friends became convinced that the Russians were actually going to take over the United States this year. And we formed a guerrilla army that would wage partisan warfare out in the woods. And we dug caves into hillsides and stockpiled our pathetic, ammunition and things. But we were ready. Let the Ruskies come. We were ready.
Each day in school, kids were told that war could break out at any moment, an atomic war in which millions would die.
Attention! Attention! This is an official civil defense warning. This is not a test. The United States is under nuclear attack.
Americans reacted to communism by developing an almost religious conviction that communism and everything connected to it was evil and immoral. And everything about America was perfect, that America was the shining beacon of liberty and freedom.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. By the way, infiltrated civil rights groups, anti-war groups, the women's movement, all these things he saw as signs of communist infiltration. So that's the story. Marty, you must have grown up with this story. That's what we were told. Hide under your duck and cover, hide under the desk. The communists are coming. Anything the U.S. does is in response to this threat. And this is no doubt what Donald Trump talks about. He says, let's make America great again, go back to this era of fighting evil. So the question is this the only possible version? You have Americans helping people get their dead, you have find their dead in Guatemala, you have Colin Powell saying we stand for human rights around the world, you have President Barack Obama saying this is our enduring legacy to fight for freedom and democracy everywhere. And yet, if you pay close attention to the news, you start to see some things that are cracks in the story, like this piece I caught in CNN, etc.
A Roman Catholic nun's keeping vigil across the street from the White House to protest human rights abuses in Guatemala. Claire Shipman takes a look at this mission born from personal agony.
It's been 6 years since Sister Diana Ortiz, a U.S. nun in Guatemala, was abducted from her convent and then, she says, repeatedly raped and tortured. And she thinks one of the people involved was a U.S. agent.
Perhaps the most painful, ugliest part of the torture was witnessing the torture of other people and being forced to participate.
Her case isn't new, but now, frustrated by what she says is a lack of support and information from the government, she's holding a vigil across from the White House, hoping to prod officials to be more forthcoming. President Clinton has ordered a broad investigation of allegations of human rights abuses in Guatemala by the Intelligence Oversight Board, which should be complete within months, at which point much of its information will be declassified. And in the meantime, officials say they're in constant contact with Sister Diana.
You have great sympathy for her, for the suffering she experienced following her abduction in November of 1989. And we continue to urge the Guatemalan government to identify and to take appropriate action against those responsible for the crime.
Guatemala has one of the worst human rights records in Latin America. The Guatemalan army routinely accused of atrocities. U.S. interest in events there intensified, though, when Jennifer Harberry pushed the administration with a hunger strike, demanding more information about her rebel husband who disappeared there. Late last year, 9 CIA officials were disciplined for mishandling information about his disappearance and other cases. Harberry is now trumpeting Diana's case.
Suffered it over and over again. Poor Sister Diana, she's very traumatized. Maybe she doesn't know what really happened to her. How convenient. I lived with Sister Diana. She knows what happened to her.
Privately, government officials say there's little doubt Ortiz was tortured and raped. But inconsistencies in her stories have led to some skepticism of her charges that an American was involved, and they don't predict any breakthroughs in the investigation. She's not necessarily expecting any, but hopes her vigil and the media attention will prompt the government to declassify more documents than it might have otherwise.
The tortures continue in Guatemala. I mean, she remembers still, the screams of the other women who were being tortured at the same time. She can't get them out of her mind.
It's information, and as much of it as possible, that her friends say is the key to her recovery. Claire Shipman, CNN, Washington.
So that's something that sounds a little off there, non-rape, tortured, Americans in the background, but the officials deny it. A lot of the news that we've seen is from officials. They can't entirely ignore this because she has this vigil across the White House. And then here's another, something that doesn't quite fit the story. This is about Jennifer Harbury, you just saw him there, a Harvard-educated lawyer, suing Secretary of State for something about hiding things about her husband. Here, about I left in, as I sometimes do, the ad.
Is there even one trash bag that doesn't rip, tear, drip, or spill? Tomorrow, we put trash bags to the ultimate test. See how yours holds up under our pressure on Good Morning America.
At the Supreme Court today, a woman named Jennifer Harbury argued to the justices that she should be allowed to sue former U.S. government officials who she holds partly responsible for her husband's death. And we're going to take a closer look at the case of this very determined woman, because however the justices rule, her case has already shed light on the U.S. involvement in Guatemala during the late 1980s and early 90s. Ms. Harbury argues that she might have been able to save her husband from the Guatemalan army if U.S. government officials had not lied to her. Here's ABC's Jackie Judd.
Jennifer Harbury had 30 minutes before the Supreme Court today to explain a decade's worth of pain and persistence.
I want justice for my husband. I still don't have his body back, and I refuse to just forget that he ever existed and that it was no big deal what was done to him.
Her husband was a Guatemalan guerrilla leader known as Everardo. The marriage of an uneducated peasant and a Harvard-educated civil rights lawyer put Harbury on an unlikely journey.
Many people tell me that I should just start over. There is no life in front of me while that's behind me.
Mi esposo, Efraín Bamaca Velázquez. When Everardo disappeared in 1992 at the hands of the Guatemalan army, Harbury got a huge amount of attention from her campaign to save him. There were hunger strikes, protests, a badgering of American officials for information and for help. In 1995, she finally learned her husband had been killed, including details of how he had been tortured on orders of a Guatemalan officer who was on the CIA's payroll.
I spent every night for more than 2 years now going to bed, and the last image I have of my husband is him strapped down to a hospital table, being pumped up with some kind of toxic gas until his arm and leg ruptured.
The news convinced Harbury to go to court. She believed U.S. officials had deliberately kept her in the dark, a charge they denied, and that they should be held legally responsible. Harbury won that argument in a lower court, but the Secretary of State at the time, Warren Christopher, then appealed to the Supreme Court that he not be held liable.
I could have saved his life if I had not been lied to. That's what this case is about.
For Harbury's opponent, she is an irritant. One says he doesn't know if she is a saint or a nut.
Let them live the last 10 years that I've lived and see what they have to say then. Let's see how hard they would hunt for their spouse. Let's see if they've ever cared for anyone the way I've cared about my husband.
Win or lose in the Supreme Court, Harbury says there will be other battles for her to fully avenge the death of her husband. Jackie Judd, ABC News, Washington.
When we come back this evening, the final item in our broadcast, the Battle of the Minds. Words and puns, and of course, the crossword puzzles.
Often don't do this, the lead-in about garbage bags and the crossword puzzles at the end, just to show you how easy it is. Sometimes students watch stuff, they say, well, how can anybody not pay attention to what they just heard? Well, because they're very easily distracted. And but here you have two things that don't seem to quite fit. And then you have this little puzzle that you often see in news stories. Is she a saint or a nut? You figured out objective journalism. So a little later, I'm actually going to let you listen to her at greater length, talking about her book and her search for a husband. And you tell me whether you think she's just an irritant and a nut or something different. Journalists are often confronted with the question of why they cover these things so poorly. And some of my students have heard Edwin Newman narrating a documentary about television and the Vietnam War, and here he is at the 92nd Street Y, answering a question about why news was so slow to cover the CIA's involvement in Guatemala, and then he also expands it to other countries. And I think if you listen carefully, you see something interesting here, and that is that he presents sort of an incomplete syllogism, where he seems to know enough about what's not reported to explain why it's not reported, but he doesn't tell you. He won't tell you why it's not reported. He won't tell you what it is that's not reported. So see if you can fill in the syllogism, the only thing that makes sense to fill in the missing premise.
When I comment on the Guatemala CIA story and how far I think it's going to go, I do not have an opinion that I think is worth having, certainly not worth listening to anyway, on this matter. But this, in a way, raises a question related to the question we had before. Why did this go on for so long without its being reported? And one reason is that there has been a disinclination in the United States to do any reporting about Latin America. That has been the case for decades, many decades. We don't really look very much at Latin America. But it wasn't only Guatemala, it was Nicaragua, Panama, among other places. And clearly this is an area in which the press, news people generally did not do what they should have done, or perhaps I should say did not do what we should have done. And there is perhaps a disinclination on the part of some people in the business to appear to be anti-United States. One is, you can become uncomfortable opposing United States policy and being critical of American policy, so not everybody wants to get into that. But this is obviously one area in which the press, news people, fell short, and there were others.
All right, so it's kind of very interesting. So he sort of says, if journalists are uncomfortable critically they're challenging U.S. policy, then there's some middle thing missing. And if blank, then they won't report on Latin America. It's an incomplete syllogism. So just put it in syllogistic form. If U.S. journalists are uncomfortable being critical of American policy, he said, and if he seems to know something that fits in here that he doesn't say, then U.S. journalists will not cover Latin America very well or very often. So what's the only thing that makes sense to put in the middle premise that would make that a logical syllogism? One of my students in the class.
That unjust or corrupt.
That's the only thing that makes sense, right? To say that if U.S. journalists are uncomfortable being critical of the United States, then there has to be something to be critical of, right? Then you won't report on it. If the United States just did wonderful things in Latin America, then it wouldn't make any sense, right? If you don't want to be critical of the American policy, the United States does wonderful things, well then you would report on the wonderful things. Right? The only thing that makes sense to fit in there is that the U.S. must not do very good things there. And so this raises the question of whether there's kind of a secret history of the United States in Latin America and elsewhere. My students have just watched Bill Moyer's The Secret Government, which makes that case. And I didn't get to read, just handed the papers yesterday, so I got to read it. I was glancing at them. One student wrote, this was like reading about another planet. Like I'd never heard about any of this. Another student wrote about studying the Cold War in high school and never hearing anything about this secret part of the U.S. actions in the Cold War. And this was not unintentional. The idea was to hide this stuff from you. And before the U.S. did its major mission in Guatemala a year before. They did a mission in Iran. So we'll just look quickly at the beginning of the CIA.
When demonstrations like these began in Iran in 1979, Americans were stunned to see such outpourings of anti-American outrage. But Iranian hatred of the U.S. did not evolve overnight. It reaches back over 35 years and can be traced to a British-American secret operation codenamed Ajax. In 1951, Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized his country's oil fields. The British, who had controlled and profited from Iran's oil, decided to act. They found an ally in the United States, which was fearful of Mossadegh's independence and friendly overtures to the Soviet Union. Together, Britain and the United States conspired to overthrow Mossadegh and replace him in power with the young figurehead of the Iranian government, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. What the world was told about events in Iran went like this.
Former Premier Mossadegh's ruined house is a mute testimony to 3 days of bloody rioting culminating in a military coup from which the one-time dictator of Iran fled for his life. In a quick shift of power, Mossadegh was finally apprehended and awaits trial for treason. Iranian oil may again flow westward.
What newsreel audiences of 1953 did not see was this man, Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, and CIA undercover officer.
In 1952, I went to examine the situation and see what might be done, and then came back and waited until the Republicans had come into office before proposing it to the State Department, because I knew that they wanted the plan. It was the first coup d'etat that the agency had ever been involved in, and the agency thought that it was possible based upon my reports.
He's happy to see you smiling.
Roosevelt's plan for overthrowing the government was simple. Like a master parade marshal, Kermit financed mass mob demonstrations against Mossadegh.
Agents were very effective. They had promised that they could produce a mob to go against Mossadegh, and they did. And that mob marched on Mossadegh's residence and forced him to flee.
The Shah, in exile during the unrest, returned to claim his throne. America and Britain divided equally 80% of profits from the oil fields. The Eisenhower White House was delighted.
That was the first mission. Of course, it didn't turn out that well for the Iranians, and the secret police set up by the CIA saw about killing and torturing tens of thousands of people. And then it didn't turn out too well for the U.S. either. So one person who was involved told me, well, at least we got 26 years out of that one. Yeah, but then you got the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution and all the problems that evolved from that, and Iran lost its whole move toward democracy and secularism that it had, and a source of potential stability in the region and stuff. So that is the type of thing that we also, my students have seen in recent days, is very undercovered in the relationship with the United States and Iran. Iran is always presented as a threat to us, and when Iran mentions shot down a drone, if you take it in this context, you'd understand why they might shoot down the drone, but instead of presented as an aggression against the United States. And when the United States shot down a civilian airliner, Iran Air 655, the United States lied about it, denied it, and has never to this day, 30 years later, apologized, though they did eventually make some payments to the people whose relatives had been killed in that. So you have a more complicated history than we tend to be presented with. I showed my students how you can turn the story of the United States and Iran into all three of the world views. But before that, I just want to point out that Kermit's views on how the United States should treat other people were not that inconsistent with that of his grandfathers. This is Kermit, the gentleman you saw there smiling a little bit about them taking his advice on how to overthrow the government of Iran. This is him when he was a little younger. And this is what his grandfather said about the white race, that we should have wars with savages, and even though it would be terrible and inhuman, that we have to drive the savage from the land, and that civilized mankind will be able to pay debt to those people who do this, and that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of their red, black, and yellow Aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world races. So I was never taught that about Teddy Roosevelt when I was in school. Any of you hear that? What type of things he was saying? So you see again this issue of censorship in the U.S. news media, and in class we took, and my students have this on a worksheet in the manual, we took these sort of incontrovertible facts about the United States and Iran. Iran is on the border, during the Cold War, on the border of the Soviet Union, and we turned it into 3 different stories. So if we focus on, I use a red pen for the Cold War, the Reds, border on the Soviet Union, and the Prime Minister Mossadegh nationalizes the oil companies. Nationalism is communism. We don't want to mention democratically elected. That's the wrong story because that fits in a different view. The Iranian communists supported this nationalization. We don't want to mention the CIA organizing the coup, but they can have a popular coup, overthrows him, and puts a leader, a strong free world leader. And we don't want to mention the CIA training the secret police, but we can talk about the Shah as a strong ally of the free world. And then when Americans are taken hostage, you don't want to mention that there were students that would suggest they might know something. It would be better to be communists or terrorists. And that the Soviet Union was pleased, and that this made the country ripe for Soviet takeover, so we got the Cold War story. Then we could tell a human rights story where the British oil company controlled most of Iranian oil. The Iranians wanted to control their own resources. They had a democratic leader who wanted to help take it back. That the CIA organized a coup to take away their democracy, and that the CIA trained the secret police, torturing and killing, arms merchants, oil companies taking over, all factions hated the Shah and the U.S. backer. Their people are tortured, and the U.S. All these. The stuff that would fit, that maybe the U.S. didn't do the best things there, right? And then, of course, that doesn't look good. That doesn't fit Edward Newman's want to criticize the U.S. So the dominant story in our media just starts with the seizure of the American embassy, and then we just cross off everything else. We don't want to get too complicated. Let's not confuse the public. Those terrorists, we want to call them students, the terrorists seize the embassy, and the government backs the terrorists, and everything else is, and then the U.S. calls Iran an outlaw nation because they violated our embassy. You all know that story. So that's so we saw you could turn that into those 3 stories, and from as many or the most number of factual dots as you can. You should be able to account for them. There are always nuances, there are always things that complicate it. But so you can't just leave out a whole history. So if you tell a story about the United States and Iran, and you leave out the fact that the United States organized a coup against a popular government, put in a dictator, and kept him in power for 26 years, if you can't account for that in your narrative, that's not a really good story. You gotta include that in some way and figure out how it will make your narrative work. And so it's not that the U.S., not that you never see these things. That was a public TV documentary about called Secret Intelligence, about the role of the CIA. And here you'll see something like this in Time magazine in 1990, when the First Gulf War was being threatened by, and then executed by Herbert Walker Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush president. And then you see this thing about, well, you know, H. Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the general in the Gulf War, he grew up in Tehran because his father had worked for the CIA and helped organize the coup. So there you have some information. But look at what page it's on and how much attention it got. Here it is. It's on the People page. And you have like father, like son. So I don't know how many people would even look to read that. Or you'll have a page like, you'll hear about deaths, and you do have how the U.S. toppled, brought him back, he was restored to the throne with the help of the CIA. He created the dreaded Savak, doesn't mention the CIA, helped him create it, to stamp out dissent, and but you don't have usually a lot of details about that on the role of the U.S. It's just a little tiny story. My students have also seen how often corrections, which dramatically changed the story, are put in a little thing like this. Like a member of the Reagan administration admitted that, actually the Grenadians, we said we went in to rescue the medical students, but actually the government of Grenada said if you're worried about the medical students, just come and airlift them out. And then we really went in there to get over the Vietnam syndrome and to prove that America could win a war, so we picked this little tiny country. That came 12 years after the invasion, and it was in a little tiny correction, a paragraph long, including the fact that the Reagan administration also altered the transcript when the Korean Air 007 was shot down to make it look like the Soviets knew it was a passenger jet and shot it down on purpose when actually they didn't know that. So there's kind of big corrections to be in one paragraph and a little similar to this type of paragraph on the page. And so this gets, before we look further at some of the details of the U.S. and Guatemala, this gets to, in the video I'm going to show you, gets to the question of the whole issue of the consent of the government. And that is, do we really have the type of democracy that we think we have? Do you really yes, the public 80% wants to start this war or start that war, but is that consent natural based on the actual facts? Or is the consent being manufactured by making up BS that gets you to think, well, what else can you do? If they're going to be, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, he's threatening the U.S. and he's an ally with Al-Qaeda. We have to go get him. If communists are taking over here or there during the Cold War, if we have to go do these things. If our medical students are threatened, we have to support this invasion. And even if people are killed, then it's just necessary. We can't have Americans stay hostage and so forth. So this raises the question to think about as you watch the next more detailed story of the U.S. and Guatemala. Noam Chomsky's claim that every country wants to control its people. Every government wants the people basically not to revolt. And there are different techniques that are used. In dictatorships, the main technique is to threaten people with violence. If you speak out or you do something you're not supposed to do, you show up at a protest, then we arrest you. If somebody complains, we arrest them. If you keep doing it, we kill your family, we do whatever we need to do. And he said that that's not really a very effective means of control, because you can control temporarily people's behavior, but you can't change their thinking. And Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union, they had 35 full-time people monitoring him. Just think about the math there. If people start to protest, you've got to have 35 people protesting. Each person just can't do it. And ultimately, some of the people who are monitoring him say, "What the hell? I don't want this system either." Right? So it's not a very effective system. Much more effective for controlling people's behavior, says Chomsky, is to control their thinking. If you keep telling them the stuff you saw Colin Powell say, Barack Obama say, and you leave out all kinds of stuff about the history of your country and the actions of secret parts of the government, and you have people believe, then they control their own behavior. They don't come to open forums to discuss this thing. They yell at people who raise these questions. They attack them as anti-whatever, in this case anti-American, and you've got a much more effective system of control for racism.
Well, I was just going to ask, do you think that there's a certain consumer responsibility here in terms of the media, that people search media that confirms their own narrative and reject as the liberal media things that they don't want to hear?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I'm doing this talk, because I'm saying you've got to consume more wisely. And just as we rate the seller of online products to see what other people said about how accurate the product information is, you should rate the seller when you get news as well. And but we also have to hold the media accountable, because when the State Department makes up another news story, you almost never see the media saying the State Department said this today, but they've always lied about these things in the past. You know, you don't rate the seller. So let's look a little more detail now about the U.S. and Guatemala, and you'll see, Nancy's comment about how much responsibility is here for the public and how much news media. I think that's actually co-responsible, is co-related. We are in a free democratic country. Most Americans thought it was fine for the United States to bomb Afghanistan after Osama bin Laden launched an attack from there. Osama bin Laden, of course, was not Afghani, and the country was so unstable because of prior U.S. action there that the people had no real control over Osama bin Laden, who was Saudi. And yet, people didn't protest. Thousands of people, more than were killed in 9/11, who were not in any way combatants, killed in U.S. bombings. So if they're responsible for what somebody did in their country without having a democracy as we have, and we have some supposed control over our leaders, are we not also then, by the same reason, legitimate targets for people in countries that the U.S. that are terrorists attack there? So that's a provocative way of looking at it. So with the Guatemalans, well, I'll show you this and then ask whether, if the United States attacks a country, do the people there have the right then to decapitate the leadership of the United States or do a preemptive strike on us if we do it to others? I use the we there on purpose in that case.
America's economic might was backed by an awesome military power at the service of a Cold War crusade to fight communism. It was a strange mixture of good works and ruthless power politics. In 1953, a new branch of the American government called the CIA staged a covert coup in Iran to protect oil interests. In the United States, Eisenhower needed voters to support his foreign policy. Using marketing techniques learned in the campaign, his administration packaged the ruthless tactics of the Cold War as a goodwill mission for democracy. There was little truth in advertising.
Fighting ends in Guatemala. These rebel troops, backed by air power, have compelled the ousting of Guatemala's pro-communist regime and have won a ceasefire from...
This is the story that most Americans heard. In fact, it was raw fiction, an imaginary revolution invented by the Eisenhower administration. The truth was that the U.S. government had staged a coup of a democratically elected government to protect U.S. economic interests.
It was economic imperialism, done covertly under the name of democracy and anti-communism, done by the CIA with the American press kept out in a way that would make it look like it was something very different.
One of the key operatives in this elaborate cover story was an ex-Marine named Phil Redinger.
I was called over to the Latin American branch, and one of my friends was over there, and he said, "Say, we've got a job for you." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "We want you to take over the government of Guatemala." Of course, I've been hearing about this, but I said, "Well, what do you? This is out of my activity." He said, "Listen, you're a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, and you can do anything. You know that, don't you?" Nobody in the government ever thought that Guatemala was any threat to the United States. What they were the threat to was the United Fruit Company. That's the only reason in the world.
Fruit was known as the octopus for the way it held Guatemala in its grip. The octopus controlled 40,000 jobs. It owned half the country's arable land. Almost all the country's railroad tracks belonged to United Fruit. In 1952, Guatemalan workers toiled for 50 cents a day. United Fruit reported an annual profit of $65 million, twice the total revenue of the Guatemalan government. 50 ships, known as the Great White Fleet, hauled the bananas away to American supermarkets. They were sold under the brand name of Chiquita. The man who ran United Fruit was Sam Zamora, whose nickname was Sam the Banana Man. In 1952, Sam was not happy. A new government in Guatemala wanted some of Sam's bananas. To improve social conditions, Guatemala forced United Fruit to sell back part of its land, then gave it in parcels to 100,000 peasants. It was the brainchild of an idealistic president, Jacobo Arbenz, who thought land reform would save his country. He might as well have declared war on the United States. In the Eisenhower administration, the Secretary and Undersecretary of State, the head of the CIA, and the UN ambassador all had ties to the United Fruit Company. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was a fanatical anti-communist who saw the Cold War as a biblical struggle between good and evil. Foster's brother, Alan Dulles, ran the CIA. It was a very convenient relationship, avoiding unnecessary debates about policy.
Foster Dulles, with his own sort of Presbyterian belief in the rectitude of himself and the United States, and our way was the best, and his brother Alan Dulles, infinitely more likable, more charming, more graceful, a great flirt. He loved the parties, and it seemed to be a reassurance when he was there. The right kind of people were doing it, and they weren't going to do anything that the good people of America didn't approve of.
In the matter of Guatemala, the Dulles brothers hatched a plan to topple the Arbenz government while creating a cover story to hide American involvement.
What the Eisenhower administration wanted, if at all possible, was to pretend that it was the Guatemalan themselves who had done it. It's so good for propaganda. The Guatemalan people rising up against the communist tyranny. Where is the communist tyranny if the United States has to invade to overthrow Arbenz? It's much better if it is the Guatemalan people.
To create the illusion of a popular uprising against Arbenz, the CIA needed to find someone to lead the newly invented rebellion. The man they cast in the role was Castillo Armas.
I looked at this guy, this little guy, kind of nervous little fellow, and I told him, "Is that the guy?" And he said, "Yes, that's him. We're going to make him president of Guatemala." I said, "Oh my God, come on, now this is ridiculous. We're going to spend all this money to put this guy as president of Guatemala?" Well, we had, he was the only guy we had.
With a leader in place, it was up to Rettinger to train the rebel army. The troops mustered on a United Fruit plantation.
The force that went into Guatemala to take over was a very, very small force. It wasn't more than 20 or 30 people. I had to help train these guys. Of course, we armed them, and we took them out on the firing range and did that. Very, very primitive training. It wasn't anything fancy at all. What we tried to do more than anything else is imbue them with the idea of taking over their country. And some of them were pretty excited about it. And some of them were not too excited about it at all. They didn't want to get shot.
While field agents set about scripting the revolution, Alan Dulles worried about the American press coverage. He wanted good reviews and no mention of any American role. Luckily for Dulles, United Fruit had been hard at work spinning the story. United Fruit hired Ed Bernays, a public relations expert, to sell the American public on the dangers of communism in Guatemala. Bernays put together expensive junkets for the reporters.
You script the tour. You invite in a dozen reporters, people with not much connection, not much knowledge, no knowledge of the language or the background. And you go here, you see the good works, here's the hospital we do, let's go see a typical worker in his home. And it worked by and large. There were an awful lot of newspapers in America who weren't going to send reporters to cover Guatemala unless it was all paid for by United Fruit. So it played to the laziness of the press.
When the reporters returned home, they repaid United Fruit's kindness with just the kind of stories the company wanted to see. Only one journalist bucked the official line, the New York Times correspondent in Mexico, Sidney Grusin.
You only had to look. Nothing was hidden very much. You could go outside the main city and see the training. You could see the troops that we'd bought. You could see the old airplanes that we'd given them. And there's something in the air in a town like Guatemala City when the thing is bubbling and you just know something is going to happen.
Grusin wrote about the secret U.S. mission and the success of Arbenz's land reforms. Furious, Alan Dulles arranged a luncheon with an old Princeton classmate, the business manager of the New York Times.
Julius Ox Adler goes down to see Alan Dulles, and Alan Dulles convinces him, and it doesn't take much convincing, that Sidney Grusin is something of a security risk and should be kept out of Guatemala at this critical time when the coup is about to happen.
I think they either hinted or said outright that they thought I was a communist sympathizer, if not a communist.
Taking the CIA at its word, the New York Times cabled Grusin and ordered him to cover the Guatemala story from Mexico City.
The quiet, covert assault by the head of the CIA upon the reputation and credibility of an excellent reporter, and the knowledge eventually that it had been a red herring, that Grusin had been red-baited, meant that it would be less likely to be successful in the future. John Kennedy once tried to ice me out of Vietnam, and the Times had been inoculated and wouldn't do it. I mean, Sidney got moved out of a story as I did not get moved out of a story 8 or 9 years later.
On June 15th, 1954, Eisenhower gave the Dulles brothers the go-ahead for the coup. 3 days later, the CIA brought Castillo Armas to the staging area.
We took him out to where the troops were, and I said, now here they are, you lead him up there. But it was really a pitiful force that went up there. They had a hell of a time, of course. They ran into all kind of trouble.
At the very first sign of resistance from government forces, the rebel army turned tail and fled back to Honduras. Afraid the ragtag rebel army might be destroyed, the CIA ordered Castillo Armas to camp 6 miles inside the border and wait for further instructions. Meanwhile, at the UN, U.S. Ambassador and United Fruit stockholder Henry Cabot Lodge tried to put events into perspective.
Because it is certainly true that the United States has no connection whatever with what is taking place. The information available to the United States thus far strongly suggests that the situation does not involve aggression, but is a revolt of Guatemalans against Guatemalans.
On June 26th, Eisenhower agreed to supply the rebels with American planes and pilots. When one pilot accidentally dropped a few bombs on neighboring Honduras, the CIA hastily wrote a cover story blaming the incident on the Arbenz government.
Responsible. Reporters are flown in for a first-hand look at the results. A few small holes in the airfield caused by bombs that didn't explode. Nevertheless, their falling stirs up strong resentment in Honduras over an unwarranted air attack.
In the capital city, the CIA broadcast a fictional account of the rebel advance. While the American embassy played battle sounds from huge speakers on its roof, American planes swooped past the National Palace. On June 27th, Arbenz stepped down.
He realized when we started flying American planes over the city and bombing it, he knew the Americans were involved, and there's no way that I can win this one. I'm sure he thought that.
Meanwhile, the problems of correspondents who covered the brief revolt are graphically shown too.
The situation firmly in hand, the CIA let the American media in to cover the story.
And the story is good. Communism for the time being is on the run in Guatemala.
Castillo Armas was installed as president, knowing he had the full support of the United States and the United Fruit Company.
President Armas presents the chief executive with a presidential seal worked by nuns in a Guatemalan convent. The president, as he admires
the president, was just tickled pink the way the thing went. It was very inexpensive, very inexpensive. And we lost none of our people, and lost very few of anybody.
The U.S. and United Fruit were pleased with the budget price of the coup, but the ultimate cost to Guatemala was very high. A few months after the coup, 7 leading labor organizers were mysteriously murdered, and all of the unions were banned.
The cost for Guatemala is one, the best government in the history of Guatemala was overthrown. All the reforms are eradicated. The 100,000 peasants lost their land. Then, what the United States did was to strengthen the Guatemalan army and created a Frankenstein that has ruled Guatemala together with the Guatemalan upper class ever since then, and which is responsible for the slaughter of about 150,000 Guatemalans, for making of the Guatemala the worst human rights case in the hemisphere.
United Fruit saw profits rise once more, while Americans remained largely unaware of the secret subversion of their own democratic principles. The supply of bananas had not been interrupted.
Well, now that you've seen where bananas come from before they reach your table, our journey to Banana Land has ended. We hope you enjoyed the trip. We know you like bananas.
Our sins were that we crushed a very small country, and in so doing we learned bad lessons which would come back to haunt us in some ways in Cuba, and I think in Vietnam as well.
1 year after the Guatemala coup, the United States began funding an anti-communist government in South Vietnam. Back home, few Americans paid attention to Guatemala or Vietnam. There were other things to occupy their minds. In 1955, new phrases entered the American language. Automated, church key, cue card, demolition derby, rock and roll, UFO, cleavage. That same year, the country caught Davy Crockett fever, as kids who loved the TV show bought $100 million worth of coonskin caps and fringe leather jackets. The American public would not become aware of their secret government until the 1960s, when a failed invasion of Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs and a growing involvement in Vietnam led many Americans to question whether their leaders were telling them the truth.
So this asks the question now, who's responsible for almost none of you before taking this class knowing about any of this? How much responsibility do you bear, your parents, your other teachers, and how much in the intermediate? So I mean, there are a lot of documents and information, like this one my students have read. George Kennan, who's recently died at 100 and highly praised, about what U.S. foreign policy should be. We classified documents saying that we control most of the world's wealth, and what do we need to do to maintain this? Forget about democratization, forget about human rights, and let's deal with the world in straight power terms. How come this never gets discussed in our media as a story about the United States? Well, it doesn't fit. Those news bureaus are there in Latin America. Major news bureaus, NBC 0, CBS 0. ABC has one Latin American news bureau in Coral Gables, Florida. And I went to visit it, there was no one there, it's not open on the weekend. Mostly presents the Cuban community. How many companies control most of the news media in the United States? Well, now we're down to about 6 companies. You can see this used to be, in '83 people were worried there were only 50 companies. Now they're down to about 5 or 6, and they all do business with each other, which means if you do what Edmund Newman said journalists don't want to do, and you speak in a critical way, well, you don't have that many other places to work. You've got, you're basically sort of one company. But the information is there if you pay attention, you guys. And I told you earlier, I'll let you be the jury on whether Jennifer Harberry is a saint or a nut. So let's let her speak a little bit. And it's C-SPAN. She's speaking. The audio quality is not terrific, but try to listen. Not like great TV, but try to listen to what she has to say and see whether she's a saint or a nut. Both of which dehumanize her.
This is a picture of my husband, Efrain Bamaca Velasquez. I always knew him as Everardo, commander of the Mayan resistance forces in Guatemala. The story is about him. The book is about him. But I hope as you read it and as you listen to me speak briefly tonight that you'll remember that this face is just one of 200,000 faces in Guatemala. 200,000 people that were dragged away, kidnapped by the Guatemalan army, secretly detained, tortured for a long period of time, and then tossed into an unmarked grave. This is the face of an XX. His body lies somewhere. The army doesn't care to say where, and it's one of 200,000 people that we need answers for, more answers than we have. I'm very lucky in many ways in that I'm alive to ask for answers, and also that I have the partial answers that I have been able to retrieve out of the files of the CIA, out of the files of the State Department, that I've been able to piece together at least some information. I have many women friends in Guatemala who to this day get up at 3 o'clock in the morning because they can't sleep and stand there ironing their husband's shirts. I have a friend in Chicago who still doesn't dare return to Guatemala to look for her two daughters, who would be in their 20s now. 15 years ago, she left home to do a few errands, and when she came home, the house was full of blood, wall to wall. Her husband and her father were missing, and so were her 2 infant daughters. Maybe they were killed with the father and husband. Maybe they were taken and sold into an illegal adoption ring. We don't know. She'd like some answers, and I think all of the Guatemalan families really deserve to know what became of their family members. Who was to blame? They deserve to be able to go to the courts and take these killers off the streets. So again, as you read this testimony that I've given in this book, just keep all of the others in mind and understand that this case is just symbolic. It represents all of the others. And it points out what needs to be done in our own country as well as in Guatemala. I guess tonight I'd just like to give a brief summary of what I know happened in this case and answer some questions and talk about some of the issues afterwards, and rather than read from the book, because I think that all of you afterwards would be able to pick up the book and read for yourselves what my personal opinions were and what the personal relationship was about. What I know for certain happened to my husband is that he was captured alive by the Guatemalan army on March the 12th, 1992. He was literally taken in combat, taken alive. The army wanted to torture him for his information in private without the United Nations or the Red Cross or any other human rights groups causing any uproar about the Geneva Conventions. In order to torture him and break him in peace and quiet, they literally faked his death, saying that they had found his body after the combat and taken it to the nearby town of Retoluleo and buried him. They gave a perfect feature-by-feature description of this face, giving the correct age, the correct height, etc., saying this is the body we found after combat, this is the body we've buried.
It was only after 10 months that a young prisoner of war was able to escape from a military base and say that's not true, it's all a hoax. The Army is in fact torturing a selected out group of prisoners of war. Most are tortured and killed after a few days. All are killed eventually, but some are selected out for their special information. They're tortured for a long period of time in the hopes of breaking them and having them voluntarily work as secret informants for the Army. That person's name was Santiago. He himself had been hung by his arms from a meat hook and beaten with cement blocks. He was beaten across the feet with a post until all of his toenails fell out. He was beaten with electrical shocks to the testicles. He was buried in a pit under an officer's desk. Literally, they rolled the desk back, rolled the carpet back, and there was a pit underneath. He was buried in another pit in a mountainside for a number of days. He was chained hands and feet to a bed with no blanket for 5 months. They came close to breaking him, but not quite. After that, he became a model prisoner. And on March the 12th, 1992, he in fact saw my husband dragged in and being subjected to the same sorts of abuse. One of the people in charge of his secret detention was Colonel Julio Roberto Alpires, a School of the Americas graduate. So was Major Sosa Orellana, another School of the Americas graduate. Towards the end of the summer, Santiago saw my husband strapped to a bed with an unidentified gas tank next to the bed. A physician had been called to stand by to make sure he wasn't accidentally killed during the torture session. He saw my husband swollen several times normal size, one arm and leg heavily bandaged as if they had ruptured or hemorrhaged, and he said he was speaking in a raving tone of voice. We know that he survived because Santiago saw him one more time, very ill, a few days later before he himself was able to escape and tell me what had happened. I then returned to Guatemala, opened the grave, and sure enough found that it was the wrong person. It's someone who looked nothing like my husband, was 15 years too young, 5 centimeters too short, with completely different dental records, and the original autopsy showed that the face was completely different and the scars were completely different. This confirmed that the Army had in fact carried out a hoax. Much later we learned that the person in the grave was in fact an 18-year-old soldier who had been tied up and beaten to death at the combat site as a decoy for my husband so that no one would know that he had been taken alive. As most of you know, I then carried out a whole series of hunger strikes to try to find out the truth about what had happened to my husband and to insist that he be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions together with any other secretly detained prisoners of any kind. At that point in Guatemala, all we knew is that in 35 years of civil war, in the prisons there were 0 surviving political prisoners. Amnesty had often been asked, why don't you do campaigns for political prisoners in Guatemala? Well, there weren't any. It was a non-survivable event to be captured alive by the Guatemalan Army for political dissidents or for anything else. In all of those 35 years of civil war, 200,000 Guatemalans had been taken by the death squads and killed, a total that is higher than that of Argentina, Chile, and Salvador combined, and 440 Mayan villages had been wiped off the face of the map. At that point, I realized not only what had happened was exactly the way Santiago had said, but that my time was running out, that I didn't have a lot more time to save his life. So during my hunger strikes, I was asking that he be turned over to the courts together with anybody else, given a fair trial, and treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. In other words, not tortured, not secretly detained, given adequate medical care, and given any access to attorneys or human rights groups or families that he might need. That's the basic international law. It certainly is Guatemalan law as well. Of course, I went to the State Department many, many times. I was told again and again, we really don't know what happened to your husband. We're very concerned. We don't know what to do. We've asked the Army many, many times, and they say that they don't know, that they have never had your husband, and what else can we do? There's really no more that we can do for you. So in 1994, I started the hunger strike that many of you saw in the 60 Minutes broadcast, and I literally announced that my husband and I were a package deal. If nothing was going to be done for him, I was going on a hunger strike to the death, and that I didn't plan to leave the National Palace until something was done for him, or until I could find out the truth. The embassy did send someone to see me almost every day to check on my health, to check on my safety, and to tell me how upset they were and how they really didn't know what to do, that the Army had said they didn't have him, and what more could they do? Again and again, the same wording. Around day 30, when my hair was falling out and I was no longer able to keep my left eye open, when I was freezing cold sitting in the sunlight, when my blood sugar was dropping towards coma level, Mike Wallace came down from the 60 Minutes program and told me that, in fact, the embassy did know what had happened to my husband. They had a CIA report that said he was captured by the Guatemalan Army. that he was a secretly detained prisoner of war. Until then, the Army had been saying that maybe he'd run off with some other woman. Maybe that really was him buried in the first grave, but that since all Indians look alike, maybe I got confused. Apparently, the CIA bulletin informed the State Department that he was captured alive a long time earlier. At that point, the National Security Council also invited me to come to Washington and speak with them, which I did. I thought at that point that with this new disclosure and with the embassy admission that they did, in fact, have that CIA bulletin, that I would get somewhere, that I'd get some kind of assistance in saving his life. And instead, as soon as I was off the hunger strike, all doors closed again in Washington, and I could get nothing.
So it's just a little bit of a longer interview. How many of you think she sounds like a nut? Not exactly a nut. So we've solved our murder mystery that we started with. There's that movie where the detective Memento tries to where he finds out he's the murderer, and that's sort of like where we are. We done it. We done it. We put those bodies. Our government put those bodies in that grave when we saw it together. And the only reason this came out was because somebody in the government thought that he couldn't keep lying to
Tonight, for the first time, a senior State Department official speaks out about how the CIA has exacted revenge on him. He says, because he dared to tell the truth about a CIA cover-up of the involvement of its paid informants in torture and murder in Guatemala. Dr. Richard Nuccio is that senior State Department official, a former special advisor to President Clinton on Cuba, and before that, the U.S. government's special envoy in Guatemala. Dr. Nuccio says he blew the whistle, he broke the code of silence because of the involvement of the CIA's paid operatives, its spies in Guatemala, in the brutal murders of an American citizen, the husband of another American, and what he describes as a litany of crimes against humanity.
Including torture and murder.
Torture and murder.
Torture and murder.
According to Rick Nuccio, ever since he revealed what he knew about the CIA's spies in Guatemala, he says he has been the subject of a ruthless effort, at first to prosecute him, and now to force him out of the U.S. government.
I used to work at the White House. I used to be the president's Cuba advisor. I'm back at the State Department spending most of my time trying to answer charges against me.
The CIA's charges are that Dr. Nuccio violated national security when, without authorization, he briefed a congressman on the Intelligence Oversight Committee about the misconduct of the CIA's spies in Guatemala, and that he also confirmed to the press the identity of a secret paid CIA informant. Under U.S. law, it is illegal to reveal the identity of a clandestine agent or informant of the CIA.
I didn't reveal classified information publicly to anyone, and yet I'm being hounded out of government service by the CIA for telling Congress what it had a right to know.
Why do they have this vendetta against Rick Nuccio?
I broke the code. You don't reveal misbehavior by the CIA and survive inside the system.
The misbehavior, the CIA crimes that Rick Nuccio is talking about came to his attention because of Jennifer Harmer, an American citizen who was searching for her missing husband, a Guatemalan guerrilla leader.
That's the connection here. So that's how she found out. And he was hounded out. So, again, a lot of this is not very publicly told. Occasionally you'll see there was one story in the New York Times about a truth commission in Guatemala, something we've never had in this country, blaming the United States for the death of 200,000 Guatemalans. And that's not a story that had a lot of legs. And then there was this shocking story.
The United States is apologizing today for horrific medical experiments conducted more than 60 years ago, but not acknowledged until a Wellesley College professor unearthed the grisly details. The experiments involved intentionally infecting Guatemalan mental patients with sexually transmitted diseases. In a statement issued today, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and HHS Secretary Kathleen Sebelius said jointly, although these events occurred more than 64 years ago, we are outraged that such reprehensible research could have occurred under the guise of public health. We deeply regret that it happened. We apologize to all the individuals who were affected by such abhorrent research practices. Robert Bazell is NBC's chief science and health correspondent, and he broke the story this morning and joins me now from New York. Bob, I don't know how to even begin with you on this.
For one thing,
it's so horrendous.
It is horrendous, and in addition to those two apologies, Robert Gibbs at his briefing just announced that President Obama is going to call the president of Guatemala shortly to apologize even more. So the United States deeply regrets this incident, but it shows the kind of medical imperialism that was going on in those days after the Second World War. Samples of syphilis and other organisms were shipped from laboratories in Staten Island and were put into these people who were prostitutes, mental patients, and prisoners, and they were told to infect other people. And the injections included even putting them into their spine. And most of them were treated with penicillin, but about a third of them never got any treatment at all. It is going to go down as one of the most horrendous chapters in the history of medicine. The head of the National Institutes of Health said that today, and I don't think anybody would argue with it.
So it's the same people, by the way, who did the Tuskegee syphilis study very well in Guatemala. One of their students, Mark Hiller, is a professor here at UNH. He was not involved, but he said, his boss thought, well, this was, just deal with blacks and let them suffer from syphilis entry, and that's good for the Teddy Roosevelt notion of the real human race, and that's people in Guatemala who really care about them. Also, 2008, this story that United Group Banana was involved with death squads. So this is not an old story. It's also a current story.
For American corporations, the rewards of doing business abroad are enormous, but so are the risks. And over the past 25 years, no place has been more perilous than Colombia, a country that is just beginning to emerge from the throes of civil war and narco-terrorism. Chiquita Brands International of Cincinnati, Ohio, found out the hard way. It made millions growing bananas there, only to emerge with its reputation splattered in blood, after acknowledging that it had paid nearly $2 million in protection money to a murderous paramilitary group that's killed or massacred thousands of people. Now the Colombian government is talking about extraditing Chiquita executives to Colombia, and investigators in Bogota and on Capitol Hill are looking at other U.S. companies that may have done the same thing.
An ongoing story here, not just a new one. But most of the networks say they just don't have the resources to cover. They can cover celebrity weddings, but they can't go all the way down to Latin America and cover any of these things. Although CBS News Bureau has no, CBS has no real news bureau in Latin America. They did recently show some interest in survivors in Guatemala, but ones who still have their skin on. It is their Survivor reality TV show.
Survivor Guatemala, sponsored by Olay. Love the skin you're in.
So I hope I've raised some burning questions for you to consider, and I will send everybody an annotated list of the videos that we watched, and to contemplate your responsibility to find out whether the government has done, is doing, to rethink the narratives in the news media, which are often presented as, it's often presented as the United States being attacked by other people, and we'll be beginning of the Monday class, I'll quickly review what we watched today, and we'll look further into the U.S. Army School of the Americas that Jennifer Harbury mentions, which is known University of Latin America as the School of Assassins. Many people who have graduated from that school involved in coups, murder, and torture, and that the U.S. says it needs to, well, it used to say it needed to fight communism, and now says it needs to fight drug trafficking. You see all the ways that this is constructed in our news media, interesting stories like you'll see a headline in the New York Times to say CIA shedding its reluctance to enter the drug war or to fight drugs, and you have to read the continuation deep into it to see the CIA has actually been involved in selling drugs to fund its covert operations, which kind of makes a mockery of the headline. So there's, I think Nancy Lambert's question is a good one. How much responsibility do the news media have for this? How much responsibility do we as citizens have? And I guess I would tend to weigh them both, and certainly weigh that in a free country where we claim we have the right. I'll ask students to say, well, we have the right to find out what our government's doing. I say, well, how often do we do it? Well, we don't have to do it, we have the right. Therefore, we don't have to do it. We have the right to find out what's going on. So, how many of you listen to alternative news media? We've got one hand going. Again, our student educated outside the United States. So you don't take any responsibility to find out what your government has done, what it is doing, what it could be doing. Then, certainly there's responsibility on the hands of the people who distort the information in your textbooks and in the news media. But the information now, more than ever, is out there available to everyone to gain access to. We sent you in the announcement of the sessions, a list of updated and enhanced list of alternative news media sites. I also listed the National Security Archives, which has collected a lot of documentation on Guatemala. It turns out the U.S.-backed security forces actually took pictures of everything they did. And these atrocity, they're called the atrocity files. And I don't know if you know about these, but they need help. They need some of you guys to go down there and help them document this. As I said in that opening video, so that people can be held accountable and then people can't deny that this happened. So those of you who are able to stay for a bit to debrief and discuss, that would be great. Any comments, questions, remarks?